Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast. Produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Now, let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. So today we're talking about sleep, and especially sleep problems in children. I love this topic as soon as I heard about it, especially because I got to sort of relate a little bit more to my childhood and how long it usually took me to fall asleep as a kid. And apparently the way that I've done it or have done it in the past, and the way that my parents probably started it as well, is not the way that's supposed to be. But here to sort of help me understand it a little bit more and help us understand how to put your child to sleep properly is Edith Botchway. How are you going today?
Good. Thank you, Dina. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm really excited to talk about sleeping children with you today. And let me say that I believe your parents did what was best for you at the time.
Okay, good. Okay, we have that. So if my parents are listening, then you did a good job.
Yes.
All right. So now, before we get started, do you mind talking a little bit about how you got started talking about sleep? Because it's very interesting from what she was telling me so far.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Edith Botchway-Commey, and I am originally from Ghana. My interest in sleep really started during my bachelor's in Ghana when I was studying psychology. And I don't really know where that part of it started, but for my bachelor's thesis, for example, I did research looking at the relationship between relaxation and music. So that kind of sleep, consciousness, relaxation topic has always been a thing. Mm-hmm. But the real love for sleep was kindled in me when I did my master's in the Netherlands. And there was this particular course we had called Seminar in Cognitive Neuroscience. And as part of that course, we had a lecturer coming to talk about sleep and consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I was so fascinated by the topic that I went to talk to the lecturer after the class, and I was like, I'm so interested in this. I think I want to learn more about it. Is there a way that I can learn more from you? Mm-hmm. So he offered the opportunity to volunteer with his lab at the Netherlands Neuroscience Institute, and I did that for like 6 to 8 months, and it was such a great time because I got to learn how to score sleep data. I was sitting in meetings where they're just talking about sleep and 7S and all of that, and I just got so interested in the topic. After that ended, I continued to still have that interest in sleep, went on to do my master's thesis and something slightly different. But when I got to do my PhD with the University of Melbourne, that sleep interest came back and I ended up looking at sleep in young adults who had brain injury when they were children. And that is where, the sleep in children and the impact of sleep in the long term, or impact of childhood sleep problems in the long term kind of evolved for me. Yeah.
Wow, it's a very interesting journey of how you sort of fell in love with the whole topic. Because it's not something that you talk about that often when it comes to children, especially.
Yes.
Until afterwards, like me, for example.
Yeah, until afterwards. And definitely in more recent times, this is talked about a lot more. But like you rightly said, sleep was something that was relegated to the background. It's like, people would say things like we sleep more when we die, and people would say sleep is a waste of time and all of these myths around sleep. But in recent times, research has really brought sleep to the limelight, teaching us more about the importance of good sleep habits on our health and well-being. So I'm glad to be part of the research community that is contributing to educating and building up the research work on that. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing, especially the amount of opportunities that you've gotten to work with the people sort of furthering their career as well, and you get to sort of see firsthand how they do the research.
Oh, yes. It's been a delight, working with very good researchers, learning from great researchers like my master's supervisor, Marsh Corning's excellent researcher, Professor Vicky Anderson, who a lot of people know at the University of Melbourne, Katika Tropa. These are great researchers, and I'm just so privileged to have the opportunity to learn from them how to do research and be a great researcher.
Well,
which I'm still aspiring to be, by the way.
Well, from the amount of searches that I've done in you is sort of look into your background a little bit. There's a lot of research that you've done so far.
Still getting there.
Yeah.
Very young. Still an early career researcher, so I have a lot of learning and growing to do. But yeah, thank you.
Yes. Awesome. So before we get started, we love to start with a little icebreaker just to sort of get to know you a little bit more.
Yeah.
So when I say these phrases, just come up with the first thing that sort of comes to your head.
Okay, let's do
No
that.
pressure. So the first one is a favorite book of yours.
Okay. My favorite book at the moment is Tribe of Mentors. That book was recommended to me by a colleague mentee of mine that I met through a mentorship program years ago. And I've loved the book and I continue to learn from it. I feel like I can't listen to it enough times because there's so much in there. And in this book was written by Tim Ferriss. And in this book, Tim Ferriss interviews a group of mentors that he calls like a tribe of mentors.
Yeah. And
he has a set of questions that he asks each person. There are different lengths to the interview. So some he may ask 3, some more questions, depending on, I don't know, the time or some other factors. And it's just great to learn. Well, so through those questions, you get to learn a bit about who the people are, but you really get to pick up on their motivation, what drives them to do what they do, but also things like how they are balancing the awesome things they are doing in their lives with their families and like also maintaining their well-being. And I've definitely picked up a lot from that. But one of the key things for me from that book is the questions that he asked. They're such great questions. And I have personally adopted some of those questions for my learning lunches or learning coffee times. So every now and then I'd approach someone that I really admire or think is doing really well in their field, whether research or in another field, and just ask them for maybe a lunch or a coffee time. And during those times, I would ask some questions so that I can learn from their career journey or their life journey. And I use a lot of the questions that Tim uses because they are such great questions and they help you to learn from a person within a short time. So a question like, how has a failure or an apparent failure set you up for later success? And do you have a favorite failure? It's a great one that I like to ask. And I've learned a lot by asking people that question. Thank you.
No, I think that's amazing. Just saying what they've done wrong or what they've sort of like failed at. Because you ask, what have you achieved so often?
Exactly. But no one wants to talk about the failure.
No, exactly. And I think we don't normalize that enough. And it's amazing. I love those questions. I'm probably going to start to adapt to those too, because I love learning about that kind of way of people, especially their reaction to that question.
And how like I love how people see failure in their response to that question. And and it just really encourages you, because we all fail at different things at different times, but it really encourages you to keep that positive perspective on things and keep going.
No, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So the next question is your favorite movie.
My favorite movie. That's a really hard one to answer. So I love movies. I love mostly historical epic movies, but I also really love action movies that are based on maybe war or crime. And for action movies, I love anything with Jason Statham or Keanu Reeves in it.
Yep.
And so you can imagine I'm really excited to watch John Wick 4 that just came out in the weekend.
Yes.
My favorite movie at the moment will be John Wick. My husband and I just spent the last 2 weekends watching the 1 to 3 so that we can watch the 4 this weekend.
Oh, I'm very excited for that one.
And I love that movie, not just for the great action, but also I admire John Wick's dedication and commitment to love, freedom, and friendship. And I really root for him in his quest to conquer this dark world that's ruled by these powerful people who have obviously taken advantage of his commitment to the institution.
Yes. I also love the way that the way that they sort of slow the movie down and sort of understand him a whole lot more in each movie. It's very different.
It's very different. It's like, okay, this is a badass assassin, but for some reason you end up liking him and you want to support him to, you know, achieve what he's trying to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people that watch it, when they start watching it, they're like, okay, so he's starting a fight because someone killed his dog.
Yeah, it's like someone killed your dog. Okay, so you're killing all these people because they killed your dog. But
it's
the
so
values underlying that is so much more deeper.
Yeah, it shows his loyalty to everything that sort of comes his way. And I think that's what we always forget. We forget about the loyalty of the characters.
Yeah, so no matter how small that thing or it may seem. Yeah, so
exactly.
Really cool.
Yes.
Good to know you like it. So have you seen the 4?
I haven't seen 4 yet. It's on my list and I'm waiting until I have free time. Probably this weekend I'll go quickly rush in and see it.
I can do that.
I also heard that it was Jason Statham as well as your favorite favorite sort of actor. Yeah, he's been probably my crush since I was very young, which is very bad because he's probably 30 years older than me. But yeah, I don't know,
his dedication.
Yes. And the way that he does his own stunts as well is also one of the big things for me.
Oh, he's awesome. I think I've watched all his movies.
Yes.
Like, pretty much.
Same.
Yeah.
I'm very much so. So the next question is a favorite podcast of yours.
Yeah. Okay. So I really like podcasts because I grew up listening to a lot of radio talk shows. And so podcast is a great replacement for me now. My favorite genre are around leadership, personal development, and high performance. So at the moment, I have 3 favorite shows that I follow quite regularly. So they are the John Maxwell Leadership Podcast, the Motivation with Brendan Burchard show, and then Impact Theory with Tim Bailey.
Okay. So what about them do you really admire in their shows?
The John Maxwell one, for example, brings on a lot of great the team itself are like the bedrock of leadership training in the US especially, but they've also done a lot of training around the world and keep grooming leaders in different sectors on how to lead. So you listen to that show, as junior as I am, still opens me up to some of the insights about leadership. And I feel like it's just such a topic that I enjoy listening to.
Yep.
But you also get a lot of motivation and tips on how to, you know, build your work-life balance. So they kind of mix it up a little bit. It's not all just leadership. And Brendan's show is great. He kind of, like sometimes some of the tips he shares is like, okay, he's really disciplining me now. Things like, how to schedule your day. So practical things like that. How to make sure that you're not procrastinating. So it gives you tips on how to limit procrastination and very practical things. So I just like to do things that I do well. And I think these shows help me with little and sometimes big tips on how to structure my life so that I'm doing things well.
Yeah.
Like that, it's really important to me that when I commit to something, I'm doing it really well.
Yes.
And I think the tips that I learned from these shows help me.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah. That's so great. So this sort of fits in really nicely to a famous role model of yours.
Yeah, that's such a hard question because so many people have influenced my thinking, my career, and who I am today, including my family and a lot of mentors. So it's hard to single out one, but I think a famous one would be Michelle Obama. And the reason is because I really admire her zeal for life, social justice, and humanity in general, you know, just wanting people to do well and wanting to support people.
Yeah.
But I also really respect how she prioritizes her family, how that she shows that so well. And I admire that.
Yeah, no, I think she's one of the biggest influences for me as well. Like just the way that she sort of brings out, like you can tell what she stands for the minute that you meet her.
Yes.
The minute that she's on an interview, you know exactly what she's interested in.
Yeah.
So I love the way that she carries herself through everything. So
Same here. Same here.
And it's amazing. It's amazing just how influential one person can be.
I know. And heard conversations around whether change requires a group of great people or one person. And I think it's more driven by one person who has the right, whose heart is in the right place for whatever cause it is. And then they can bring people around to effect that change. And I think she's definitely one of the great people who is able to do that very well.
Yes, no, I definitely agree with that. And the last question is a course that you have completed that you really enjoyed.
Yeah, I think I've kind of touched on this a little bit in my introduction. So that would be the seminar in cognitive neuroscience course. And that's because it introduced me to sleep and really ignited my love for sleep research. And I'm really grateful that I was in that course and that I got to be in that lecture. And I remember one of the things that I felt the first time that I listened to that lecture was, this is so fascinating. So it was mainly based on the neuroscience aspects of sleep, like brain areas involved and how, all of that. And it was so good. And I was like, this is so fascinating. I could talk about it my whole life and not get bored because there's so many facets of it. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. So we're starting the questions now and sort of talking about sleep and talking about children's problem in sleeping.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about it in introduction, sort of how you got into it.
Yeah.
Before we get started, we love to have the question with every guest.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is your definition of parenting?
That's a very interesting question, considering that I'm not yet a parent, aspiring, but not yet. So I think that parenting is a unique and privileged opportunity to love, care for, and guide a young person through life. I think parenting is one of the most amazing things a person can get to do in life, but I also think it can be very challenging because every child is so unique and requires to be parented per their unique qualities and aspirations. Yeah.
That's a really good definition. I think because everyone has a very different understanding as to how it could be a positive or negative experience for each individual, which sort of sets the definition
for parent. I feel so too. And I think when you don't have kids yet, so the definition can be very positive.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think
until you're living the experience.
Yes.
But fingers crossed, it's gonna be good.
Yes, I have a lot of friends who have kids, and I'm like, I love hanging out with you, and then I get to hand you back. So like the moment that I get to hang out, I get the fun part.
Yeah.
And then they get the fun Aunt Dina, but the rest of the time they have their mom. And I'm like, I'm glad I get to toss you back to them.
Yeah. You just deal with the nice parts of them.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So talking about sleep, how do you define the sleep problem of children?
Okay. Thank you for the question. Before I move on to talking about sleep problem, how I define sleep problems in children, I would like to mention that I assume that in this podcast, we are using the words children broadly to cover all humans between 0 and 18 years old. And I think that emphasis is important because sleep looks quite different for different age groups.
Okay.
So the 0 to 18-year-olds within the literature, there are subdivisions to it. So children between 0 to 12 months are called infants. Children between 1 to 2 years are toddlers. Children between between 3 and 5 are preschoolers. And 6 to 12-year-olds are school-age kids, and then 13 to 18 are teens. So going forward in my responses, I will try to touch on the sleep problems for these developmental age groups because sometimes they're a bit different. Sometimes I'll lump some groups together if they're a bit more similar.
Okay.
But I'll try to just delve through that so that every parent that's listening, depending on the age of their child, can get something out of this podcast that can be helpful for their child's sleep. So now to answer your question, I define sleep problems in children as any sleep-related issue that is or can affect the child's health, well-being, and functioning. In Australia and worldwide, it is estimated that about 20 to 40% of children and adolescents experience some sort of sleep problem within this 0 to 18-year group. And it is important to know that this incidence rate is a lot higher in children with certain disorders or neurodevelopmental disorders like kids with ADHD or autism or cerebral palsy or brain injury. So within those populations, the incidence rate tends to be between 40 to 70%, depending on,
Okay.
Yeah. So, those kids and those families tend to have it a bit harder than kids without those kind of problems.
Yeah. So when it comes to the sleep problem, why, for example, like the question that it comes up, how do you define sleep problem? What usually is the definition of a sleep problem then?
Yeah. So it is any problem sleep related and sometimes wake related that so when I say wake related, something like daytime sleepiness that has an effect on the child's functioning. So if there's a visible effect on the child's functioning and that problem has been going on for a while, mostly between like 1 to 3 months, and if it's happening maybe more than 3 days in a given week, 3 or more days in a given week, then that's could be a sleep problem. But every sleep problem has different definition. That like there are different kinds of sleep disorders. So each of them has got their different definitions, but this is the broad definition that you can give to sleep problems. So there's a problem that is affecting the child's functioning, whether it's making them more sleepy during the day or they are not concentrating in class or something, then which you can connect to sleep, then you can call that a sleep problem.
Okay. So what is the association between the problem of children sleeping and sort of parenting and parenting techniques or skills?
Okay, that's such a great question because in my opinion, this is an aspect of child sleep health that needs to be talked about a bit more so that parents can know maybe what they're doing or what they can do to help their children sleep better. And I should mention that the association between child sleep problems and parenting can look quite different depending on the age of the child. So I'm going to talk through this starting with the 0 to 5-year-olds. And I would say that you should bear with me because I'm going to go through a bit of research findings, but also I'll do that for different developmental ages. So I'll start with the 0 to 5-year-olds. And in this group, one study looked at the relationship between parenting behaviors and sleep in infants and toddlers, right? So that, 0 to 2-year-olds. And they concluded that high levels of parenting involvement in soothing at bedtime, but also throughout the night is associated with fragmented sleep in infants. That study was done by a group in Israel, led by someone called Seder, and it was published in the Journal of Sleep Medicine in 2010. So this finding shows that when parents are overly involved in soothing the child and especially are there for them when the child falls asleep, the child tends to have limited capacity to self-soothe or self-regulate to sleep. And that means that they become dependent on receiving that soothing technique or that whatever the parent is doing to help them sleep whenever they need to sleep. There was another study that was done in preschoolers, and that study focused on 3 to 4-year-olds. That study was actually done in Australia. It was a longitudinal study looking at early predictors of later sleep problems in 3 to 4-year-olds. It was led by someone called Lam and was published in Pediatrics in 2003. So an old one, but a really good study. And in that study, they showed that mothers of children with sleep problems reported significantly higher depression symptoms and more limitations in their daily functioning. So again, showing that having a child, so that finding shows that having a child with sleep problem is related with poor mental and physical health in the parent. But I should mention that there are some other studies that have showed the opposite effect, that having a child with having a parent with maybe psychological issues actually impacts on the child's sleep health. And we will see that as I continue to talk about this. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. So there's a bit of a bi-directional relationship there, depending on the age group. Still in this 0 to 5-year group, a lot of studies have showed associations between child sleep problems and parenting, and have related that to things like the child's intrinsic factors, so things like the health state of the child or the temperament of the child. So, for example, if a child is a bit sick, so maybe has neurodevelopmental condition, then that child may tend to need a bit more attention at bedtime. And so that health situation may be interfering with how well the parents can practice some of the things that I would recommend later. However, it is good to like keep in mind the good practices even in those challenging situations, so that you are helping yourself but also helping the child become independent in sleeping gradually.
Okay.
Then some of these studies have also related child sleep problems with parenting interactive factors, like the parent's attachment style, so how the parent likes to connect with the child, or their soothing methods. So, for example, if a parent prefers to bottle feed or nurse the child to sleep, and the child gets used to that, then even when they wake up in the night, they want the parent to come nurse them to sleep. So that those kind of factors also kind of explain some of the variance in the relationship between sleep problems in children and parenting. So I'll move on now to talk about the 6 to 12-year-olds.
Okay.
And in this age group, similar research findings has been reported, as I discussed in the 0 to 5-year-old age group. So one of such studies was led by someone called Burgess. It was a study that involved 107 children, and the kids were between 2 to 12 years old. And they reported that parents of children with sleep disorders reported higher levels of daytime sleepiness and poor daytime functioning.
Okay.
And again, this shows that having a child with sleep problems sometimes can impact on the parents' functioning during the day. And in addition, within this 6 to 12-year group, the relationship between parenting and child sleep problems has been associated with things like the parents' routine. So it's either that there's no routine or that the routine is inconsistent that can affect the child's sleep pattern or the child's ability to sleep well.
Okay. Is there a different routine between when they're 2 to the earlier stages and to now, and to sort of 6 to 12? Is there a very different sort of way that a routine should be set in place? I don't think that there can be any like rules around what a routine should be for a family, because those things really depend on what works for the family, you know, their work arrangements, whether they're working from home or working shifts, and all of this is so complex. So the general advice is like for parents to try to develop routines that work for their family, but to keep in mind that maybe your child needs this amount of sleep, and they should be getting that. Their routine should be worked out to make sure they're getting that amount of sleep and things like that. But I think that definitely when the child is very young, between 0 to 3 months old, the parents don't have a choice of routine. It's like it's whenever the kid wants to fall asleep.
Exactly. Your life is kind of revolving around the kid. So that's a very different story from later on when the child maybe has a more stable circadian rhythm, and they and you can kind of work around that and have them sleep when you want them to. So
when they're like going back to the 0 to 3 month old, and is there, like, I know a couple of videos that I've seen throughout social media is the soothing method, and there are different soothing methods. There is one that I've seen recently of the only way for the child to fall asleep is for the parent to sleep either in the crib with them or to sleep in the bed with them. And that's the routine that they've found works for the family. Can that sort of affect the relationship between a parent and a child later on in life? Say, for example, they're 6 to 12?
That's a very interesting question. And I wish that I had more literature to answer, especially the later part of your question about whether that can affect the relationship between the parent and child. I don't know. It'll be interesting I can get back to you on that if you want.
I'd love
know
to
if there's some research work looking at the relationship between that particular soothing method and later. So
there's a whole lot of different ways that a parent can sort of influence a child's sleep. In either a positive and a negative
or a negative way.
So especially when it comes to, I think what was interesting when you said earlier, when you talked about the parent also going through some things or dealing with their own life as well, and then having to sort of deal with a child at the end of it.
Yeah.
And their lifestyle can severely be dependent on the child or can also influence a child's way of sleeping.
Yes.
Which is really interesting.
That's really interesting, you know, how that parenting style and just even the parent's mood. So you can imagine if maybe a parent is not getting good sleep for let's say 3 months, and so their mood is just not in the best place over that period, and over that time they are probably not so aware of things going on with the child or having as much time to listen or support the child as possible, and that goes on for a prolonged period that can really impact on the child's psychological health, but also their sleep, as we have learned.
So we're talking about the amount of sleep and just the amount of sleep that a child is supposed to have. We know that different stages, I think it's always said, and I think I've seen it somewhere, that different age groups are meant to have a different hours of sleep.
Yes.
And
very much so.
So what are the ages the age range that is sort of recommended the sleep to be influenced by?
Yes. Thank you for asking that question. Generally, the amount of sleep that's considered necessary for a person tends to change across the lifespan. And generally, we tend to have more sleep as infants, but the amount of sleep required tends to decrease as we grow older. So like you rightly said, there are different recommendations for different age groups. And there are a couple of organizations and websites that put out recommendations, but the ones, and they are very similar in the amount of sleep they are recommending for age groups, but the information I'm about to share is from the Sleep Health Foundation of Australia. So that's the Australia's sleep research and practice body, and they are internationally recognized. So based on the recommendations from the Sleep Health Foundation of Australia, newborns between 0 to 3 months old are recommended to have 14 to 17 hours of sleep per 24 hours, including naps. And I should mention that children are not born with a circadian rhythm, so their brain is not able to distinguish day from night. And so that's why kids within the 0 to 3 months old have got such sporadic sleep patterns, sleeping multiple times during the day and also at night. Their circadian rhythm tends to start developing between 6 to 8 weeks. And so that's when some stability begins to form.
Okay.
And during this time, they typically would take about 2 hours to 3 hours of sleep, like random sleep periods all throughout the day, including naps. Based on the recommendations, 4 to 11-month-olds are recommended to have 12 to 15 hours of sleep per 24 hours, including naps. 1 to 2-year-olds are recommended to have 11 to 14 hours of sleep per 24 hours, including naps. And 3 to 5-year-olds are recommended to have 10 to 13 hours of sleep per 24 hours, including naps. And I should mention that naps tends to cease around this 3 to 5 year period. And so if you have a child that's a lot older than 3 to 5 and keeps taking so many naps during the day for extended periods, then you probably want to talk to your GP about that and see if everything is okay. 6 to 12-year-olds are recommended to have 9 to 11 hours of sleep per 24 hours. And 13 to 18-year-olds are recommended to have 8 to 10 hours of sleep per 24 hours. I'd like to add that the hours of sleep that a child needs are very different for each child. So it's important that parents observe their child. You know your child, but also know your child's sleep preference and their patterns. It is, however, highly recommended that your child gets the same amount of sleep every night, and almost every night, and that the amount of sleep that your child is getting is within or close to the recommended sleep range for their age group. It is also important that parents set a sleep time that allows the child to get sufficient amount of sleep for their age group. So, for example, if you have a household where there is a teenager who is 14 years old and and a school age kid who is 8 years old, you want to set different sleep times for these kids because the amount of sleep they need is quite different.
Yeah.
So you want to put the 8-year-old to sleep a bit earlier than the 14-year-old, so that you don't frustrate the 14-year-old by putting them to sleep too early.
Yeah.
But also so that you are not putting the 8-year-old to sleep a bit too late, that they don't get enough sleep. So it's really important to be aware of these recommendations so that each child is getting this amount of sleep that they need to feel well rested. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's amazing just how much was researched into the amount of hours recommended. And it's always fascinating to me when they say that there are hours that a child should fall asleep for. And the fact that it's different for each ages is very interesting. Imagine like the research going into it to discover
so much work has gone into that over the years to come up with these recommendations. And research is always evolving. So as research evolves, there are some recommendations are adopted, sometimes also for specific settings. So when you look at recommendations for this from the American Center for Disease Prevention, I think it's called, their recommendations are very similar to the recommendations from the Sleep Health Foundation of Australia, but I think for one age group it's slightly like different by 1 hour.
Yeah.
So I think they do that based on their recommendations are provided based on what is most practical for the setting, but also based on the science of how much sleep kids within that age group actually need to be on their best function and behavior. Yeah.
It's always, especially when talking about, I know like the early ages, the 0 to 3 one is very interesting, especially the 6 to 8 months that they're just constantly going to be falling asleep whenever they...
Yeah, the 0 to 3 months. Yeah. The first 6 to 8 weeks. Yeah, yes. When they are constantly... Yeah, it's so interesting how the brain evolves to curing... to developing the circadian rhythm and just using that light cue to distinguish between day and night.
Yeah, because it must be those 6 to 8 weeks must be so difficult for a parent as well, just to know.
I can imagine.
To know the child's sleep schedule and to know that they're just going to fall asleep whenever.
Yeah. It's just so hard, especially the first few days when it's just like, oh, okay, now they're sleeping. What do we do?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting question. This is a question that I think is when I first thought about it, when I first sort of came up with it and when I first discussed it with the rest of the team, it was very interesting to me because I'd love to know the different kind of indications that a child sort of signs out when experiencing sleep problems.
Yeah, that's a very good question because it gives the opportunity to actually show parents some of the things to look out for so that they can help their children in this aspect of their health. So I think that the behaviors and signs that indicate that a child is not having enough sleep can be similar, but also differ slightly between ages. So I'll first talk about the 0 to 5-year-olds, and then I'll talk about 6 to 18 years because I think they're quite similar within those bands.
Yeah.
So I think parents who have kids between 0 to 5 years old should be a bit concerned if they see signs of, if they see these signs consistently over days or weeks. So things like the child appearing tired most of the time, if the child is irritable most of the time, if the child lacks interest in people and in the environment, especially if they are looking away from things that usually stimulates them or gets them excited, if the child is fluttering their eyelids a lot during the day, it's probably because maybe they're sleepy, or if they're yawning a lot, these 0 to 5-year-olds, that can be an indication that, okay, probably didn't sleep well. If the child appears to have trouble breathing or snoring, or is just breathing noise with a lot of noise, then it's probably an indication that maybe if that goes on for a prolonged period, then you probably want to get their respiratory system checked just to make sure there's no blockage. So that's preventing them from breathing well during sleeping. If your child has unusual nighttime awakenings or night fears or terrors that is to a concerning level, then you probably want to talk to your GP about that. And last is that if your child is obviously maybe not getting enough sleep per the recommendations that I talked about with regards to how much sleep children should be getting depending on their age, then you probably want to pay attention to that so that you're giving them a bit more opportunity to get the amount of sleep that they need. I'll now move on to the 6 to 18-year-olds. And for this age group, I think parents should be concerned if they see the signs consistently over days or weeks. So if the child, the school-age child or adolescent has problems waking up in the morning, if you have to drag them out of bed pretty much every single day, then it's probably sometimes it may be because they are tired or being a bit lazy or just want to spend a bit more time in bed, depending on what is in the bed. But sometimes it may be because they are not well rested, and you probably want to consider whether they are sleeping enough and why they're behaving like that. If your child has early morning or chronic headaches, pretty much every morning, that can sometimes be a symptom of that can sometimes be an indication that they are not breathing well during sleep, because some studies have found that chronic headaches in children around this age is associated with sleep apnea. So And
so what is sleep apnea?
Yes.
For those who don't know.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. So sleep apnea is when breathing suddenly, repeatedly stops and starts during sleep.
Okay.
So person is sleeping and repeatedly their breathing is just stopping and starting, and sometimes they are trying to gasp for breath.
Yeah.
That's sleep apnea.
And
there are different types of sleep apnea, so you'd have to get assessed to determine what type. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. For the 6 to 8-year-olds, another sign that indicates that they are not getting, 6 to 18-year-olds, another sign that indicates that they're not getting enough sleep is poor concentration during the day. Also daytime sleepiness. And daytime sleepiness is a tendency to inadvertently fall asleep during the day. Also, mood swings and irritability is a big sign in this group. So the others, like always irritable or just constantly.
Yes, I can definitely see that being a sign for sure.
That's a big one. Also, if the child is consistently snoring or showing that they are having difficulties breathing during sleep, you want to talk to your GP about that. Frequent cold and infections are also can also be a sign of poor sleep, or that the child is not getting sufficient sleep. And a lot of studies have showed this. And this is because sleep is so important for the development of the immune system, but also for the fortification of the immune system. So if a child is not getting sufficient sleep over a prolonged period, then their immune system may become more vulnerable and be at a greater risk of having colds and infections. Next one is hyperactivity. And sometimes this can be mistaken for ADHD, but sometimes when your child feels like they're bouncing off the wall all the time, it's probably because they are not well rested. And you probably want to get that check as part of assessments that you want to do to see what's happening. Why are they so hyperactive? Then the last one for this age group is poor academic performance. So sleep is really important to help with concentration and attention and memory. So if the child is not having enough sleep or is not well rested over an extended period, then we can imagine how that can translate into poor academic performance over time. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there are some obvious signs.
Yeah.
And there are some that you can mistake for other
things, yes.
And it's especially when it comes to the different age brackets, like between the 0 to 5 and 6 to 12, there's very different signs.
Very different signs. And that's why it's so I'm so glad to be on this podcast and have this discussion with you so that we can inform parents on what to look out for. But you're right. It's very tricky. And that's why it's so important to talk to, not to assume that, oh, my child has ADHD because maybe they look so similar to this other child who was just diagnosed with ADHD and they're in the same class. But have your GP, talk to your GP, maybe talk to a child psychologist or a sleep specialist if you think it may be sleep related, so that you can, that you are ruling out any other possible medical factors that will be maybe leading to what your child is experiencing.
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to the 0 to 5, I think just the fact that kids falling asleep at any point of the day is a very good sign. How does it sort of affect the child's performance? So you're talking about mood swings as well being a big sign of like irritability, being a big sign. Is that also something that 0 to 5-year-olds can feel it go through as well?
Yes. So I think when I talk about 0 to 5, I also mentioned irritability.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I think in that age group, that's a big sign.
Yeah.
That aggressive behavior and irritability, just throwing tantrums throughout the day.
Yeah. So there's always a reason for that as well.
Yes.
Because I always just thought of the child being naughty or the child just sort of acting up. A lot of the times it's just easy to just assume, okay, they're just acting up or they're just a naughty child. But sometimes it may be because they've not slept well or that they're in some sort of pain. And sometimes it takes parents a couple of days to figure out what is happening. Oh, wow. Okay.
Maybe it's because, they have this pain in the ear or something. That's why they were so irritable.
Yeah.
Or just that they didn't sleep well.
Wow. It's amazing just the amount of signs that the child gives away without you even having to like ask them.
Yes.
And like being a parent, you'd have to like completely focus on
and how
my child
easy it is to miss it.
Yes, exactly.
But there is also this part where, if you become so obsessed about focusing on every single sign that your child is showing, it's like, it can drive a person crazy,
Yes.
Okay, what's happening with them right now? Okay, they weren't doing this yesterday. I think just take it easy.
No, yes. I think there's so much that a parent would have to look out for if
There'll
that's the case.
There'll be so much, and it can get so stressful. So be kind to yourself. Parenting is a lot, and I think everyone is trying to be the best parent that they can. And I think even the effort to listen to a podcast like this is because you're trying to be the best parent you can for your child. So pick what will work for your family, apply those recommendations, and definitely get help when you feel like you need it, but don't be too hard on yourself.
Yes. No, I think that's the go-to mantra for every time this show comes on. It's always something we say, just take it easy and just learn your child. And that's exactly what we're here for. So it's amazing that there are people that go and research it and look into it.
I know. And it's such a blessing, I think, to have that amount of research and knowledge on how to help kids. Because I think it helps make the work of parents a bit easier.
Yes, I can definitely see this a topic really helping a lot of parents.
Yeah.
So going back into the amount of problems that can sort of come about, what are some common sleep problems that a child can experience throughout their throughout falling asleep, and just the amount of things that they can also put a parent through?
Another great question. I think that the common sleep problems that kids experience throughout the childhood can differ per developmental stages. So I'm just going to talk through that stage by stage. And so bear with me.
Go for it.
So I'll start with the 0 to 2 year old, so infants and toddlers. And in this age group, kids can often present with difficulty falling asleep independently. And that goes back to, things like how they get attached to the soothing style or method that the parent is using to put them to sleep. So whether it is bottle feeding or nursing or rocking or, just moving them. And so when the child becomes dependent on that, they can have problems going to sleep independently. There's also they can also present with multiple and prolonged night awakens. And I should mention here that night awakens are quite normal, even for adults. A normal sleep, when you see it on maybe EEG or some other sleep device doesn't look like, okay, I went to sleep and I just had a deep sleep and I woke up in the morning. It's not like that.
Yeah.
So a normal sleep for adults comes in phases. So we've got like phase 1 of sleep. First, you're drowsy and then you fall asleep. You go into phase 1 of sleep, which is like the light phase of sleep. You go into what we call stage 2 sleep, and then stage 3, which is deep sleep, and then you go to REM sleep and back to phase 1. So a typical adult would do this cycle multiple times, maybe 3-4 times in the night. And so for a child, they definitely are not sleeping throughout the night. So some wake would happen, but I think the key thing is the child's ability to, maybe even if the child is maybe very young and needs to be fed, because, the feeding routines.
Yeah.
After that feeding, that the child is able to return to sleep independently to some capacity is helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
So what becomes problematic is if those wake periods are just so long and it's crying and then maybe there's some attachment to something that they need that is not being given to them.
Okay.
And so trying to identify what that is and trying to help the child to gain some independence around that can be very helpful.
So it's like an internal routine. So it's not something that's like set in place, but it's just something that they got used to.
So, something that they got used to because it was set in place, because that was what the parents were using, like maybe carrying them to fall asleep, or maybe having them feeding while they fall asleep, or rocking them all the time. So then anytime they wake up, even after you fed them in the middle of the night, you have to rock them.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're used to doing that.
Yes.
So that's what that refers to. And the other sleep problem that's quite common in 0 to 2 year olds is early rising. So just waking up really early in the morning, which can drive some parents crazy. I'll move on to the 3 to 5 year olds.
Okay.
One of the common problems in them, again, in that age group is, again, difficulty falling asleep independently. So if that is not resolved early on, then that can transition into this age group where they would experience problems like that. Again, multiple and prolonged night awakenings is common in this group. In this age group, 3 to 5 year olds, nightmares and night-related fears are very common. It's actually normal for this developmental age. For some reason, kids in this age group just have a lot of fears around sleep, and also around darkness and night, but also a lot of nightmares. Also, sleepwalking and sleep terrors are very common in this age group. So don't be too alarmed if it happens in your child, unless it's happening at concerning levels, then you'll probably want to get that checked. And I should mention that there's night terrors and sleepwalking tends to peak around this developmental age. And then the final one that I would like to talk about for this age group is sleep breathing disorders. So whether it is like snoring related or sleep apnea. Moving on to the 6 to 12 year olds, some of the common sleep problems with them are sleepwalking, again, night terrors, teeth grinding, and teeth grinding happens in kids, sometimes even during the day. But research shows that when it's during the day is associated with some stress or some anxiety. But in the night, if it happens during the night, some emerging research is showing that may be related to upper airway problems. So they may be struggling to breathe, and that's probably why they're grinding their teeth. So you probably want to get that checked if you notice consistent teeth grinding in your 6 to 12 year old. Snoring and noisy breathing is also one common problem in this group. Also insomnia, and insomnia is defined as difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep or just feeling unrested in the morning, even though it looks like the child has had sufficient opportunity to sleep. Daytime sleepiness is also another one. And like I defined before, that is a tendency to inadvertently fall asleep during the day. And then finally, bedwetting may be happening in this age range. Finally, I'll talk about sleep problems in the teenagers, so 13 to 18-year-olds. In the 13 to 18-year-olds, parents will notice a preference for later bedtimes and longer sleep duration and later wake times. Now, I think there will be opportunity later in the discussion to talk a bit more about why teens have a preference for this because there are biological explanations to it. It's not all acting up.
Okay.
And when this preference for later wake times and later bedtimes and later wake times becomes so chronic to the point where the teen wants to go to bed more than 2 hours later than is socially or conventionally acceptable, or they want to wake up more than 2 hours later than socially or conventionally acceptable, then they may be diagnosed or may be at risk of a condition called delayed sleep phase disorder, where their sleep phase is just, delayed in comparison to what a normal sleep phase or circadian rhythm should look like. Teens also experience insomnia, which I defined just moments ago. Also daytime sleepiness. They also are at a high risk of periodic limb movement disorders. So that is when the leg and arms twitch or jerk at night.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Have you seen that before?
I've seen that before.
Yeah?
I think a couple of my friends, they still do that. And they fall asleep and they sort of just jerk now and again.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. I didn't know that was sort of a sleeping problem.
You want to talk to them about talking to their GP about that?
Yeah, I might sort of recommend that to them.
Yeah. And the reason why that is important is that those jerks, even though they don't jerk out of sleep to maybe consciously be awake, it is sort of like disrupting their sleep somehow. So they may not be getting as much deep sleep as they need.
Oh, okay.
And another common one in teens is restless leg syndrome. And that is just the urge to keep moving the legs in sleep. And that's because the person is either experiencing some tingling, itching, or burning sensation in their leg that makes them want to move it so that they can reduce the discomfort. Sleep apnea can also be common in teens. So when they are struggling to breathe during sleep, or when their breathing repeatedly starts and stops during sleep. Nightmares are mostly common in teens, and those can be triggered by stress or anxiety in this age group, anxiety about school and all of that. I can relate to that. I used to in my younger ages, I used to dream about books and what's the exam and what I'm going to be writing. And
yes. So, I can relate to that one.
So, and some of them are horrific ones. So sleepwalking is something that's quite prevalent in kids, the younger ages, but sometimes some teens and adults also experience sleepwalking.
Yeah.
Narcolepsy is the last one I'd like to talk about for teens. And narcolepsy is quite rare. But the symptoms of narcolepsy for people who have it typically starts between teen years and childhood. And narcolepsy is a syndrome or a condition where a person suddenly just falls asleep during the day. So you know how when you're naturally feeling sleepy, maybe you're tired and then you're yawning, then you fall asleep. That's natural. But in narcolepsy, that person just drops asleep. Okay. And so there's not that natural flow to it. It's just dropping sleep, and that can last from a few minutes to about 45 minutes to an hour.
Okay.
And sometimes when narcolepsy happens, in some people with narcolepsy, they also experience something called cataplexy, which is when they lose muscle tone. So they fall asleep and also lose muscle tone. And so if maybe you notice that your teen falls asleep abruptly in a weird way, you probably just want to get that checked.
Yeah.
There are natural ways that, like I said, that people fall asleep. And so if you're not observing that natural pattern, but it looks like they just dropped.
Yeah.
And that keeps happening, then you probably just want to talk to your GP. It's probably nothing, but yeah. Okay.
Well, that's a very interesting one.
Yeah, it is.
Because it's complete opposite to insomnia then, in a way that they'll just fall asleep.
Yeah.
So it could be in mid-conversation. And then the child just sort of...
Yeah. I don't know about mid-conversations, but definitely just sitting by yourself and just dropping to sleep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very interesting one.
Yeah. I watched some videos on a girl on YouTube who actually has lived experience of narcolepsy, and she talks about how she really has to plan her day carefully, thinking through everything she's doing just in case it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, because she doesn't know when she'll have an episode.
So it doesn't even happen at a certain...
No, there's no pattern to it.
Oh,
you
wow.
can't predict it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It's it's a very interesting disorder, but definitely not a pleasant one for people living through that because
No, definitely not.
It can really disrupt your life.
Yes, especially in the pattern of when you talk about the sleep schedule and the sleep hours that you're meant to have, and can definitely disrupt that for sure.
Yes, if you're like sleeping, abruptly during the day. Yeah.
So when talking about this, what are some effects that sleep problems have on a child's health and also their development in so many ways? Because you talk about the different ways, and then I'm also thinking about the cognitive disruption that it can have.
Yes, that's a very, very good question. And so I will start talking about, I'll handle this in two ways. First, talk about 0 to 5 year olds, some of the effects that sleep can have.
Okay.
Poor sleep can have, and then I'll talk about the 6 to 18 year olds.
Okay.
So in the 0 to 5 year olds, again, the child, poor sleep can be associated with tiredness during the day, low engagement in activities, poor concentration, decreased brain development. And I think this point about brain development is really an important one that parents should note, because sleep is important for the child to enable the child to consolidate things that they're experiencing and learning during the day, even in babies. But also sleep is actually really important for the actual development of the brain, because there are studies that have shown that children and also adults who have like better sleep patterns and behaviors have better brain connectivity than people who have consistently had poor sleep over a long duration. In addition, there is a system in the brain called the glymphatic system, which is actually a mechanism that the brain gets into to cleanse itself of neurotoxic waste. And those neurotoxic waste tend to gather from stressful activities and just things that we're doing during the day. And the brain has a way of cleansing those things out through this glymphatic system or glymphatic mechanism. And studies have shown that the glymphatic system is active only during sleep and during a particular phase of sleep, and it tends to be dormant during the day, so it doesn't work during the day. So if you're not getting enough sleep to allow cleansing of maybe your child's brain over a consistent period, then they may have poorer brain health over time.
Okay.
Sleep is also poor sleep in 0 to 5 year olds can also affect their learning. Because sleep is important for concentration, like I mentioned before. It can also lead to irritability and frequent negative emotions and frequent cold and infections. I'll move on to talking about the effects of poor sleep in the 6 to 18 year olds.
Okay.
So in this age range, we have things like severe headaches, and like I mentioned before, that could be a sign of the child being at risk to sleep apnea or breathing related sleep problems. So you want to get that checked. Concentration difficulties, short attention span, memory impairments, because sleep helps to consolidate memory. And so there have been studies that have looked at recall or memory recall of people who have learned exactly the same thing, and maybe one group is allowed to sleep shortly after they've learned the thing, and another group is not allowed to sleep. And the group, in most of those studies, the group that sleeps after learning is able to recall better. And this has also been replicated in children. So having your child have a good sleep after a long day at school can be very helpful for them to consolidate what they're learning at school. Kids school age kids and teens who have poor sleep can also have poor decision making, because they can tend to be a bit more impulsive. Moodiness and aggression is also another one. They can also be more at a greater risk to mental health problems like depression and anxiety. They tend to show more risk-taking behavior because, again, like the impulsivity.
Yes.
And there are studies, like neuroscience studies, that have shown that actually after sleep deprivation, the part of the brain that is responsible for impulsive behavior is actually more active. So that definitely explains why like poor sleep can be associated with like more risk-taking and impulsive behavior.
Yeah.
Slow physical reflexes, so they're just a bit lethargic. Clumsiness, reduced academic performance, like I explained earlier on. And finally, poor sleep in school-age kids and teens can be associated with increased sick days and just tiredness and missing school, more days when your child misses school. And just to dwell a bit on this point, I've had very interesting discussions with some clinicians who see kids, whether as child psychologists or as sleep specialists. And from my discussions with them, they're just really interesting cases of sometimes a child who hasn't been to school for 2 to 3 months because the child says that they can't wake up early to go to school, so they just miss school altogether.
Wow.
And that goes on sometimes for weeks or months.
Yeah.
And some of the insights from those clinicians is that sometimes the child has an underlying medical condition or an underlying mental health condition that needs to be addressed. Sometimes the child is actually having genuine sleep problems.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's behavioral. So the child may be using the sleep to just as an excuse to skip school. So it's safe to not assume what may be going on, that maybe they just want to skip school. The safe thing to do is to talk to your GP or to talk to a sleep specialist or a child psychologist so that you can get to the bottom of what's going on with your child. You definitely want to rule out any mental health problems that may be leading to that. And
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
No, that's a very interesting one because I've never heard of a child just not going to school at all.
I was surprised. And those discussions have been so insightful. Yeah, I've heard cases where they're like, for a whole month or two, it's just not going. I can wake up to go to school.
I honestly, not in my household, that could never happen. That never would have been happening.
Yeah.
Even if I was exhausted, I'd still be told to go to school.
Yeah. Same in my house. Oh gosh, she'd be dead.
Like one day, don't go, it's fine. But for months on end, that is an amazing situation.
Yeah, it must be so difficult for those parents. But
like imagine the child also just not being able to function and knowing that they can't. But it would be hard to separate the fact that they don't want to go to school or they literally cannot go to school.
Yes.
So it's
very tricky.
Yeah, the poor the GP that has to go and discover that as well.
I know. And I think it's great that there is help in the community that parents can reach out for and hopefully get to the bottom of the problem.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
So now we're going into my favorite part of the questions and is talking about the best practices.
Okay.
So what are some of the best practices, in your opinion, that parents can use to sort of help children develop healthy sleeping routines and healthy habits throughout their life that they can implement to themselves?
That's a very helpful question. So I'm sure like parents are like, yes, get to what we can actually do. Yeah. So again, I'll talk through this based on the developmental ages.
Perfect.
I'll start with the 0 to 2 year olds.
Okay.
So the recommendations for 0 to 2 year olds, and I should mention that these recommendations are based on research, recommendations, but also like recommendations from renowned sleep bodies on working in these different age groups.
Okay.
So for 0 to 2 year olds, one of the recommendations is for parents to set bedtimes as early as possible, but also for parents should to consider their child's sleep. Can I take that again?
Yes, perfect. Go for it.
Yeah, so one of the main recommendations for 0 to 2 year olds is for parents to set their child's bedtime as early as possible. As I talked about before, these kids are supposed to or recommended to have about 12 to 17 hours of sleep. So you want to set their bedtime early enough so that they have the opportunity to have that amount of sleep. But also do that considering your family's needs and your child's unique needs. The second recommendation for 0 to 2 years old is to try to adopt a routine that encourages the toddler or infant to fall asleep independently. So parents can set, like sleep time routines can go for a couple of minutes to maybe an hour. So it's good to spend time with your child during that time, but try to settle them in bed by the time they are falling asleep, and try not to be there when they're falling asleep. So maybe when you know they're really sleepy, 10 minutes to when you know they will actually fall asleep, you just say, okay, now it's time for you to sleep. I'm walking out. So that they have that sense of independence and they're able to develop that sense of the ability to sleep independently. Next tip is to reduce soothing periods. So a soothing or bedtime routine that takes about maybe 45 minutes to an hour is okay, but maybe 2 hours can be a bit too long, because then a child learns to have that strong association of you being there with them for so long before they go to sleep.
Okay,
and
like
that
a special time.
Them. Yeah, and that can become a problem later on when you need that time to do other things.
Yes.
So you want to be mindful of how much time you are spending in the bedtime routine. Next is to maintain a healthy and regular daytime routine, but also bedtime routine that suits your family's lifestyle. But also keep in mind that the child needs a specific amount of sleep hours, so you want to be conscious of that. And with parents who have kids who have problems resuming to sleep or getting back to sleep after they wake up in the night, it's helpful to know that if the child gets used to maybe breastfeeding or bottle feeding to get to sleep, they form a strong association with that behavior, and so it becomes difficult for them not to have that, to fall back asleep when they wake up in the middle of the night. So you want to be conscious of that, and you want to gradually help them to sleep independently, because then when they wake up in the night, they can also go back to sleep independently to some level. I should mention that most behavior interventions in infants and toddlers are focused on reducing and withdrawing parental involvement. That's mainly the thing. And encouraging the infant to self-soothe or self-regulate to sleep. It is important to emphasize that most of these interventions will involve some level of protest or crying from the infant.
Yes.
Because you're trying to withdraw the parents, you're trying to withdraw some of the things that they're used to, and so they will protest. So tip to parents is don't feel too bad when they're crying and protesting. They'll probably do that for a few days, and then they start learning what you're trying to introduce. So be kind, but also firm. Moving on to the 3 to 5 year olds, the tips for this group is for parents to develop, again, a regular sleep and wake schedule for the child. Try to set a consistent bed and wake time for the child. So around the same time every day, they should be going to bed and waking up around the same time. Try to move their bedtime to a time when the child is more physiologically ready to fall asleep. So you could see that maybe your 8-year-old, they start yawning maybe around 8 o'clock or 7:30. So that is their body telling you that this is the time that the child is ready to sleep.
Okay.
And so if you set the bedtime closer to that time, they are more likely to fall asleep easily. So the trick is then to start your routine. Maybe if your bedtime routine is for 1 hour, you started a bit you started within the hour of when they will start falling asleep, so that by the end of the routine is that physiological readiness, so that by the end of the routine they are physiologically ready to fall asleep. And this is important because if you put your child to sleep before they are physiologically ready, they may struggle to fall asleep and they get frustrated. And then that will also frustrate because they start crying. So I hope that helps. The other tip for 3 to 5 years old, 5-year-olds, is for parents to maintain a consistent bedtime routine. So try to establish a routine that is the same every day. So for example, you say that as part of your routine, you're reading 2 books. You can read different books within that routine, but it should be 2 books.
Okay.
And you try to include things that help the child to calm down, or that activities that they enjoy.
Yeah.
And some clinicians that work with children have said that sometimes they recommend that the parents includes a snack. So something really little in the bedtime routine, and they find that to be very effective.
Okay.
So you could try that. Not too much of snacking, but just something little to motivate them.
Yeah.
And incorporate that in the bedtime routine. Parents are advised to start bedtime routines within 30 minutes to 60 minutes to the child's bedtime. And to keep the child away from TVs and computers and anything else that can be stimulating during bedtime, so that they can concentrate on the routine, but also get into the mood where they can sleep well. The next recommendation for 3 to 5 year olds is for parents to set up soothing sleep environments. So make sure that the child's room try to have the child's room be as comfortable as possible. To be dark, so you can use lights, but the lights should be dim.
Okay.
And by the time you're starting the routine, so that the child can sleep. And this is important because melatonin is the hormone that helps us to fall asleep. And melatonin is released it's released in response to darkness in the evening. So when you're starting your routine, your bedtime routine with your child, and let's say you dim the light 60 minutes, at the start of the routine. So let's say your routine is going for 1 hour and you dim the lights at the start. It helps the child to gradually, start releasing the amount of melatonin that they need to be able to, knock themselves out to sleep. Keep the room quiet. Night lights are fine, but television is definitely out.
Yeah.
And set limits. It's really important for preschoolers that you set limits, because the preschooler may try to stall the bedtime routine and say something like, oh, one more story or maybe one more snack. But parents are advised to be sure to set clear limits around that, so that you can maintain a consistent routine.
Yeah. So when talking about the 3 to 5s, there's so many vlogs that I've seen of the bedtime routine, family vlogs that set it up, and they make it look so fun and so much fun to set up. But I'm always thinking that, is it actually keeping the child awake a lot more?
So what kind of things are in this?
So they have they brush teeth time, and they brush teeth together, and they're teaching the kid how to brush the teeth properly. And it seems like a music video for some reason. That's how it's always taken. And I'm always thinking, are they actually putting the kid to sleep or advertising something?
Oh, so as you were describing that was exactly what I thought, that they are more adding the music bit to sell their blogs than actually showing what should be done. Because maybe having loud music during a bedtime routine is not advisable for you.
No, exactly. It's they're brushing their teeth and they're just dancing, and I'm you're meant to settle the child down.
Make it fun from the start, maybe brushing teeth and all of it, because some kids would try to protest through that. But I don't think having loud music and all of that I agree with you.
No, it's so funny to me, because I'm just watching it okay, you should be getting the kid to fall asleep now, not setting them up
to start another day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll move on to tips for 6 to 12 year olds. In this age group, parents are again advised to develop a regular wake and sleep schedule, maintain a consistent bedtime routine again, and set up a soothing sleep environment for the kid. Also set limits and to turn off televisions, computers, and radios, and to avoid caffeine. And I'll dwell a little bit on this caffeine part, because you'll be shocked to know how much of caffeine is present in food products that are targeting kids. And
really?
So it's not like they're drinking coffee, but actually a lot of their snacks and some of the soda drinks that they have, iced tea and some other substances, have some level of caffeine in it. So
I knew drinks did, but food, I didn't know.
Wow. It is. I think the general recommendation there is for parents to pay attention to that. Actually read the label to see what the content of the snack is or the drink is, and try to avoid giving your child that 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, because it doesn't help much with their sleep. Finally, I'll talk about recommendations for the 13 to 18 year olds. The first one is to maintain a regular wake and sleep time that can be overemphasized. Allow your teen to sleep in on weekends sometimes if you feel like they've had a hard week and they just need a bit more sleep to get by. Definitely limiting the screen time. So experts advise that within 2 hours to sleep time, you want to take away screen exposure to screens, so the phones and the laptops and the iPads. And this is because it just helps the brain to unwind, but also the brain, when the brain sees light, it thinks, okay, I'm supposed to be awake, and that prevents melatonin release.
Okay.
And in adolescents, melatonin is release is delayed. Like I explained before, it's delayed biologically in these young kids. So you want to put them in a state that helps them to release it a bit earlier, even though their system biologically is struggling to do that early enough as they would need. Daylight is so important, so try to have your teen to have some daylight every single day, and especially in the morning. So maybe the first 2 hours of the day, you want your teen to have maybe 30 minutes of some daylight, and you could do something as easy as just having them have their breakfast in the garden rather than having it indoors. Just that exposure, 15 to 30 minutes exposure to daylight can be so helpful. Evening activities, so you want to have a discussion with your team to decide on how evening activities are going to go. So by what time would they be finishing their homework, and by what time would they be finishing with all the chatting and videoing, gaming. And I think it's so important to engage your teen in this discussion rather than maybe handing out the rules to them, because when they're involved in the discussion, they can tend to be a bit more responsible for the outcome, and it works better.
Yes.
in that, using
that definitely would.
Yeah. Also, you may want to consider getting help for your teen. So, for example, you may want to look at your teen's schedule to see what activities can be freed up so that they have a bit more time for sleep. You want to evaluate their schedule to see if they are maybe overcommitting in something so that you can free them up a little bit, just a bit of help so that they are at their best, because you're the parent and they have some autonomy to make decisions, but you're also supposed to guide them and give them best advice around that so that they are not overcommitting, because in teenage years, it can sound so exciting to do everything, but that might not necessarily be the best for them, and they actually need more sleep. Children need more sleep than activity. So
yes,
I can't emphasize that enough. And it's helpful for parents to try to avoid early morning appointments for teens, especially on the weekends. So because their biological clock naturally wants to sleep in later, if maybe they're having to wake up so early for school every day anyways because they can't do anything about it, and maybe they have a morning practice session also on a Saturday morning at 7, that's a little bit too much.
Yeah.
So you want to limit that for your teen so that they can actually get a bit of more sleep, especially on the weekends. Naps can help. So you can encourage your teen to take a short nap after school just to help them recharge a little bit. But it's healthy to keep the naps under 30 minutes. So 20 minutes is healthy, but definitely keep it under 30 minutes. If you're concerned that your teen has sleep problems, you probably want to check if they have some mental health issues as well.
Okay.
Don't talk to your GP about that, because sleep problems are very related, very much related to mental health problems like depression, like anxiety.
Yeah.
So you want to have that checked. Thank you.
No.
I felt like I was going on a lot with that one.
No, I feel like especially when it comes to the practices, it needs to be defined.
Yeah.
And especially with the age groups, like the different ages are very, very specific. And they're no set. It doesn't work from 0 to 18.
No, it
They're
doesn't
all the
work
same.
like that, yeah.
So the practices, I think the routine one is really interesting. Just the routine is very, like, you have different routines with different age groups, but still the routine is there.
Yes.
And for me, it would be so interesting to look into the transition from 2 to 3 as to how the routine changes between the two.
Yeah.
Because we talk about 0 to 2 and then 3 to 5. So the transition between, how do you change that, do that transition into the different ways?
That's a very interesting question. I think that there's no set rule for like that.
Yeah.
Because it may look very different for each child, but also for each family.
Yes.
Sure. So I think generally just paying attention to what like amount of sleep your child is going to be needing by 3 and just gradually transitioning into that would be my best take on this. Yeah.
So when talking about, and I think we've mentioned this a little bit throughout the podcast, about talking to the GP about different situations to talk about the GP with, when should parents go and seek professional help for their child's problem? Like, to what extent will it take between it's something that's okay momentarily occurring and something that is actual problem?
I think that parents should seek professional help when their child has a sleep problem that seems to be affecting their functioning or that can affect their functioning. This should be done even if the child has other. I think it's helpful to do this even if you think the child has other medical conditions that you think is causing the sleep problem. And I think the reason why I think that's important is because if maybe the sleep problem can be treated for the child, that can even help improve their functioning in some capacity. It might not help a lot, but it could help improve their functioning and their quality of life in some capacity.
Yeah.
So you may want to get that checked, even if you think, okay, it's because of this condition that they have this sleep problem. You probably want to get that sleep problem assessed and treated separately.
Yeah.
Parents can first talk to their GP so that any medical conditions can be ruled out. And if the origin of the child's sleep problem is maybe behavioral because maybe they have certain behavior patterns that doesn't help with the sleep, you can consider talking to your child psychologist or child sleep psychologist in the community who can really help with strategies that can improve the child's sleep.
Okay. For me, like, it's really interesting knowing the difference between, okay, the child, it will pass, and something that's an actual situation that needs like a third party to talk about and to help work through. Because I know for parents, they're always having that struggle. And I think especially with the way that I grew up, my family, the way that our routines were for me and my sister were very different. Like, we fell asleep different times. We had different ways of reacting to get ready to go to sleep. And I think I was very too energetic for them. I was jumping off walls.
You were the child.
I was that child that was just running off everywhere. And whereas my sister was the easiest one to put to sleep. She was the angel child, and it's amazing. But for me, I think also, like, after now talking about this, and I've also kind of been thinking maybe I was just very tired, like to that point where I was just too tired. And that was my way of saying that I'm too tired, which it's not a fun way for parents.
No, it's not.
I am now going to go home and apologize to my parents.
Oh, that's so kind.
For years of putting them through hell, putting me to sleep.
That's very kind.
All right, so now we're going into the favorite part of mine, which is the practice and habit sort of debrief. Talking about, like, we already talked about a little bit about this, talk about your practices that you recommend for parents to sort of go through. And now we're talking about the benefits and the challenges that occur.
Okay.
So what are 3 of the good positive benefits that it has on sort of setting up routines and building up on routines and other practices that you mentioned earlier in the show?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think that these tips that I've shared are mostly things that parents can work on with a child. So they're I feel like to some extent easy to apply. But also, I do understand that in some settings, they can be difficult to follow. So parents can get help in the community from a sleep specialist or child sleep specialist to implement them. The second good thing about these tips is that they've been applied in several settings, so in clinical settings and in some families, and most of them have worked. And I would say that not all the tips can work for a particular child. So pick what works for your child, try different things and pick what works for your child and implement that, because even the smallest of changes can be very beneficial for your child's sleep.
Okay.
And the final benefit, good thing about the tips, I think, is that they are backed by good level of research evidence.
Okay. And with all the positives that come out through those practices, there are always challenges.
There are.
So what are a couple of the challenges that sort of occur when going through those basic routines and situations and practices that you mentioned?
So in infants and toddlers, so the 0 to 2 year olds, parents can expect a lot of crying, like I mentioned, a lot of protesting when they're trying to get the child to learn to sleep independently. And I think that a good thing to keep in mind for parents is that it would be helpful in the long run, really helpful, if you can gradually wean the child off maybe some soothing practices that they use to that may not be helping with their sleep. But do that gradually. Also factoring in your child's developmental needs and uniqueness, and I hope that you're successful with it. And the key thing is to be kind, but also be firm. In the preschool kids, these kids can often try to stall the bedtime routine. So, okay, one more snack or one more story. Oh, no, mommy, another story, please. I'll cry for another story. Again, be kind but firm, because you need to maintain the routine, and they need to get used to the fact that this is how long the routine takes, and they can push their way beyond that so that you can establish what you're trying to achieve. Finally, with the teens, parents can expect a lot of protest, especially around getting them to maybe go to bed a bit earlier so that they can get enough sleep. And also because their biological clock does not allow that. Did I talk much about that? So in teenagers, actually, their circadian system actually shifts when they hit teenagers. Their circadian system shifts to about an hour or two later. So biologically, they tend to feel sleepy a bit later than what you would consider to be usual. And this also happens because melatonin release in teens is delayed by an hour or two compared to what is normal in other age groups. So biologically, teens are really struggling to fall asleep. And that is why it becomes also so important to try to put in place all the things that can help them to sleep, like removing the screens a bit early, because the screen time doesn't help with melatonin release. And trying to create a soothing environment in their room and lighting conditions so that they can overcome some of those challenges that are presented to their sleep in terms of like the biological challenges, but also some of the behavioral and other things that can affect their sleep. Sometimes sleep problems in teens may also stem from stress or anxiety or some mental health related problem. So it's important that you talk to your GP to rule out any other concern or any other medical cause of their sleep problem before you get too worried about about what's going on. Thank you. I think that's the challenges that parents can expect, and I hope I've given a few tips to help manage those challenges.
No, I think those challenges are very, very real, and I know they're very relatable to a lot of different parents and of different ages as well. And I think the challenges are very, I can definitely relate to a lot of those challenges. So now, how frequent should a parent sort of go through those practices, like set a routine? Because I know that with every child, like there's the weekday where there's school and then there's a weekend. Should there be sort of different sets for weekdays and weekends, or that routine should be set in place 7 days a week?
That's a great question. Because of how kids learn and how that when you're teaching a child something and you change the thing so much in a different setting, then the child gets a bit confused about, okay, so which one is it? It helps to keep it consistent even on weekdays and weekends. So it's not like a strict routine. You have to wake up by the clock on 7, but wake up around this time. So you allow a bit of flexibility even within the week, but try to have the routine consistent, because consistency is the only way that the tips that I've shared can be successfully implemented. And so if maybe 1 day, 2 out of 7 days in the week, you do the routine, and then the rest of the days, maybe you're too tired to do it, it might not work, or it might take a long time to establish it. And you know how kids develop so fast. So by the time, if you're not firm on the routine, by the time you're done achieving success in that age, they've moved on and you need to adopt it again. So it's challenging, but just parents are advised to keep it consistent. And like we mentioned before, there's a lot to keep in mind. There's a lot of things to look out for, but don't get too worked up about it. Pick 1, 2, or 3 recommendations that may work for your child and try to implement those. Just little steps help. So be kind to yourself and be kind to your child, but also be firm and consistent in applying or implementing the tips.
Okay, well, that is perfect. So just in a matter of time, I might not do the questions from audience. I think I've sort of mentioned a little bit of them, asked a little bit in the interview questions.
Great.
But I'll just get you to do the open mic, and then we can close off, because I don't want to keep you here for too long.
Yes, need to get to work.
Yes, okay. So I will get ready the open mic now, and then we'll just go into it. Okay. So going into the final segment of the show, I also love the show. I love every part of it, but I think open mic is very special because each guest has a very different thing to say. So I know I've explained it a little bit to you, and I would love for you to share. I know that you have something planned to talk about as well, so I'm very excited to hear it.
Okay, I am as well.
So yeah, definitely. I'll give you about a couple of minutes to just sort of talk to the audience about anything that you're wanting to share with them. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. There are 2 things that I want to share in this segment. So the first is about melatonin use in children. So a bit of research has been going on in the US, and they reckon that between 2012 and 2020, melatonin use had risen for the people had spent about $800 million buying melatonin. But also, but also the percentage increase in melatonin use just keeps skyrocketing, and especially usage in kids. So that led the American Association of Sleep Medicine to form a special interest group into melatonin use in children, and they have shared some recommendations around that. And the main things to keep in mind is that melatonin so in some countries, like if you go to Germany or the Netherlands, you can't pick up melatonin off the counter. You need a prescription to get it. But in the US and also in Australia, because it's a medication that you can buy without prescription, people sometimes think, okay, it must be safe because I don't need a doctor to approve it before I use it. So there is a recognition. I don't know what the picture looks like in Australia, but I'm guessing it could look similar, where parents are using a lot of melatonin in their kids. But the important thing to keep in mind is that this is a sleep initiation hormone. It helps us to start falling asleep. And currently there is no good longitudinal data on how melatonin use over a consistent or extended period can affect a child's development or brain. So it's okay if you're using melatonin maybe a day or 2 or a week or 2, but it's not advisable to have that as a medication or part of your sleep routine for years for the child unless it is medically recommended. And like I said, it's a hormone and it shouldn't be just ingested the child just because it helps them to fall asleep and you can get to the things that you want to do.
Okay.
It's important to talk to your GP about it, even if you find it helpful for your child's sleep routine.
Yeah.
And you could also talk to your sleep specialist about it. And the reason why it's so important to get help and get medical advice about using it is because the dosage and timing of melatonin can have different effects on your child's brain or on whatever sleep problem you're trying to cure. So depending on what sleep problem they have, a specialist will time the melatonin delivery differently and the dosage differently as well. So that's something for parents to keep in mind. Please talk to your GP about it before you use it. And the same goes for any other off-the-counter medication that you found that is helping. Medications can be good, but you don't want to just use them because you can get them without prescription. I think it's important that, especially when we are dealing with kids and we don't know the potential long-term effects of certain medications, that we get the right professional advice around it.
Wow. So melatonin is essentially a drug in a way.
Well, yeah, it's a drug that's designed to mimic the brain's natural release of melatonin,
Oh, okay. So it's
because
sort of
a natural
it a little bit more.
So it mimics that hormone that's released in the brain and helps it to release faster as well.
Oh.
Yeah. So
So it unnaturally releases it.
Well, I'm not sure about unnatural.
So not in a normal way that a child.
Catalyst, how to put it.
Okay.
It just helps the brain to release it faster or more so that the child can fall asleep. It's a little bit of help. But especially because it has a direct influence on the brain, you need to be careful, especially if you're using it for a long-term period. Something that gets your child a bit lethargic because you don't know.
Yeah, that would be interesting to find research.
I don't want to find out.
No, I know. I don't want to find that as well.
Yeah, but the committee was very concerned about this, and so have released these guidelines. And
no, that's a perfect way to end this.
There is some final thing I want to share.
Perfect, go for it.
And that is about sleep outcomes in children with neurodevelopmental conditions, because that's what my research mainly focuses on. And I would like to talk mainly about sleep in children with brain injury. So sleep problems are very prevalent in these children. Like I mentioned at the start of the podcast, there are about 30-70% of these children who have sleep problems. So for parents who have kids who maybe have had a brain injury, just know that if they're having sleep problems, it's probably because of the brain injury, but it's also, there's help that you can get for them so that they can sleep better, and hopefully that can improve some other aspects of their functioning. Some common sleep problems in kids with brain injury are insomnia and daytime sleepiness, but breathing-related sleep problems can also be present in these children. These problems may be present irrespective of the child's injury severity, their age at injury, their sex, and time since injury. Because, and so don't rule out that, maybe they had the injury maybe 5 years ago. It can't be the brain injury.
Okay.
Because in my one of the research studies that I did, actually, we looked at sleep outcomes in young adults who had brain injury when they were children, and we showed that about 40% of these young adults had sleep problems. The main problem with that study is that it wasn't a longitudinal study to look at whether those young adults had sleep problems earlier on, but we definitely showed that even in young adulthood, they had sleep problems. And so maybe if there's a young adult listening to this conversation who is having some sleep disturbances, it may be related to the brain injury, but it could also be due to some other mental health or environmental factors in your life. But definitely don't discount it, because the fact that you've had a brain injury before makes you more vulnerable to sleep problems. And finally, sleep problems in children with brain injury, if they are not looked after, or if those problems are not treated, can be associated with poor cognitive outcomes, problems with academic performance, behavioral problems, emotional problems, and poor quality of life. Thank you.
No, that is an amazing thing to sort of summarize a lot of what we were talking about. And I'm very glad that you're managing to end everything up and talk about it.
Thank you.
No, it's I'm still baffled by the melatonin one, and it's still something that is stuck on my head a little bit.
Yeah. I listened to a really good podcast on it last week, and I was like, okay, well, parents need to hear this.
No, they do.
And that's why I decided to include it in the podcast, in this presentation, because I think,
no, I appreciate that being brought up.
Scary.
No, it is. It really is, especially because we don't know a lot about how it affects kids as well, and it's still something that parents go to thinking that it's okay. So
and it may be okay if it's used maybe a week or two, but sometimes because it gets okay, parents like, how that work?
I'll keep doing that.
And in some instances, maybe the child has a neurodevelopmental condition, so melatonin is recommended for the child. That is okay. As long as there is medical support or medical advice to do that, that's okay. But I think the part where I'm talking to is the parents that are picking it off the shelf.
Yes.
Because you're not even sure what dose is. Even in research settings, a lot of the dosing of melatonin for children hasn't got very solid research backing. So a lot of the ideas around how much dose melatonin children should have is based on research in kids with neurodevelopmental conditions. So it kind of reduce that dose a little bit and hope it's okay in younger kids.
Yes.
So you want to be careful.
Yes. And it's recommended to research it a little bit more for yourself as well.
Yes.
So I do want to thank you so much, Edith, for coming on and talking about sleep problems in children and really defining a lot of things that a lot of parents probably didn't know that had an actual label attached to them and had a whole theory attached to them. It's not just it's maybe not just be a child acting up. It could be something to do with sleep, and it's amazing to sort of recognize that. So thank you so much, Edith. If there's a way that an audience member would like to get into contact with you, is there a certain method that you would recommend to do that?
Yes, so people can get in touch with me via LinkedIn. So you just look for Edith Botchway-Commey. Botchway is spelled Botchway, and I hyphenate the name, so -Commey, Commey. Also on email, so you can get in touch with me via edith.botchway@mcri.edu.au.
Okay.
I should mention that I'm not a clinician, so I'll not be able to see your child clinically to help with your child's sleep problems. But if it's about just general advice, something that you want to talk through, I could probably offer some advice and give you pointers on who you can talk to clinically. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, and I will have all those links down below and all the email down below as well. So if you want anyone to sort of help talk about research a little bit more, especially on the research stance.
I am a researcher. That's what I do.
It's exactly what we have her on. So thank you so much for joining me. Thanks
for having me. I've really learned a lot, but also enjoyed the conversation. And I hope that this has been helpful to the parents who tune into this show.
Yes, and we will definitely, maybe we could have you on for another episode as well, a little bit more to talk about sort of different areas in sleep problems as well.
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much for listening, guys, and I will always, as always, see you guys in the next episode. You've been listening to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by the Parenting Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at pa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant, and thanks for tuning in.